we knew we were surrounded by 100 different militia groups, with both the local population, the truly local population, and the several 100,000 internally displaced persons, all threatened on a daily basis with violence or experiencing violence. And that, in a way, was more scary for me than actually, seeing these guys hobble in on their makeshift crutches with, infected gunshot wounds.
So welcome to the World Extreme Medicine podcast with myself, I'm Walker. In this episode, I'm speaking with Lachlan McIver on his recent book, Life and Death Decisions. So what I wanted to do really is speak to Lachlan about his memoirs that combines his personal journey together with the loss of his father, together with working in an international aid agency, navigating war-torn countries, low-resource environments, and indeed the clinical experiences which went along with such. So what we'll examine is some of the overriding themes in Lachlan's book, look at his reflections, some of his salient revelations of working in over 30 countries and regions. So Lachlan specialises in rural and remote medicine, tropical medicine and public health, and has a PhD in global health. He currently works as tropical diseases and planetary health advisor at the headquarters of Médecins Sans Frontières in Geneva. So Lachlan's work, as I said before, has taken him to over 30 different countries, and he's published in 40 scientific articles and textbooks along the way. Welcome, Lachlan, to the podcast.
Hi, Owen. Thanks so much for having me. Great to be with you.
It's fantastic to have you, Lachlan, and we just wanted to dig into the book actually because it's a fantastic read, not only from a diversity of experience, but also candid, sort of visceral accounts, really. And you open the book up with talking about sort of the death of your father, and it really does hit you hard. It's a real sort of psychological hook into the book. Could you maybe just speak to that account and how sort of you frame death, because death is almost a consistent theme throughout the book.
Yeah, look, it sounds a bit gloomy, doesn't it? But I appreciate the kind words, Owen, and the fact that you've taken the time to read through the book. So as you know, it's called Life and Death Decisions, and the title is intended to convey several layers of meaning. One is that it reflects the work that many of us do in our daily jobs as health professionals around the world. It also reflects the trials and tribulations of communities in many parts of the world when they need to make life and death decisions about food and water and shelter and security. The title also reflects my own personal encounters with life and death decisions. We'll come to the opening story about my father's death in a moment, but that personal experience of life and death decisions speaks to the very close and ugly encounters I've had with severe depression, suicidality. And I also want the title to convey in a more subtle way the responsibilities that we all take in our daily lives for contributing to processes that cause sort of harm or ill health to people around the world, when we contribute to carbon emissions and climate change, when we contribute to the rise of drug-resistant infections, when we contribute to inequalities in the health system. We're all contributing to these problems, right? So that's what the title is intended to convey. That opening scene where I found my father dead on the side of a dirt road when I was 16, he was 49, was obviously a very horrifying experience for me. A tragedy like that, completely unexpected. It was a life-changing experience for me in that moment, as well as subsequently with the impact that it had on our family. And I might be taking a tiny bit of poetic license to say that it was in that moment that I decided to become a doctor, but it was definitely a very, very significant epiphany that I had when I was already a stage in my life. When we're 16, we're all kind of trying to figure out what we're going to do with our lives, right? And I was sort of toying with the options of which one was medicine. And I think that moment, that instant, that tragedy launched me a long way down the road towards not only becoming a doctor, but becoming a doctor that was dedicated to try and improve the health of people in rural and remote areas like where I'm from.
So you mentioned in the book, actually, Lachlan, you grew up in and very much did your training in remote Australia within a lot of Indigenous groups, but also within a lot of different rural contexts. Could you maybe just speak to how that varied and or indeed prepared you for work in various places like Sub-Saharan Africa, PNG, South Pacific Islands, Indonesia, amongst other places?
Yeah, so I was shocked to discover when I did my first, excuse me, when I did my first rural placements in medical school. Not only did I want to go rural, I wanted to go the most remote you could go, the most extreme you could go. And in Australia, that means remote Indigenous communities, and they are other worlds. I have nothing but the greatest respect for Indigenous Australians and the rich history and culture that they bring to our country. But in many communities, the conditions in which people are living are appalling, and it's not overstating things to say that they are conditions that one would have said belong in the third world or in developing countries. We have in Australia some of the highest rates of diseases like syphilis and trachoma and rheumatic heart disease in the world, and that is almost exclusive to Indigenous communities. Indigenous Australians have, on average, a life expectancy 7 to 8 years less than non-Indigenous Australians, and that has improved only very slightly over the last couple of decades. And the most basic social environmental determinants of health, like food and nutrition, water, sanitation, hygiene, shelter, as well as education, employment, are far worse in Indigenous communities in Australia than I expected, and I think that most Australians still realise. So the experience of doing medical student placements in those communities was illuminating, but with the greatest respect to medical students, we're of limited use in a clinical capacity. But then when I went, it certainly definitely gave me a taste for that kind of medicine and what doctors and other health professionals, nurses, and Indigenous health workers do in those communities. So later on in my training, after I graduated and when I was on my way to becoming a rural journalist in Australia, spending time in those communities really made me feel like I was working in another country and a completely different environment. And to answer the second part of your question, that actually prepared me pretty well for the developing world work that was to follow. I think that the experience of being in those communities with those sorts of determinants of health and health problems is one side of it. The other side of it is that in Australia, over the last couple of decades at least, we've had quite a robust system for training rural journalist doctors to equip them with the skills and knowledge that we need to be able to work alone and unsupervised and unsupported in remote communities. So that training serves us pretty well in places like Papua New Guinea or South Sudan, as it turns out.
So, Lachlan, just looking at a few different contexts that you marinate through, there's a real theme to security in the book and sort of escalation of security or absence of security, actually. And I can really resonate with that from my humanitarian experience. Could you maybe just speak to how fragile, because within the book, you denote a narrow escape from kidnapping in the Congo and amongst other issues and just how quickly that can escalate. Could you maybe just speak to how you frame the fragility of security within the book and how you found that within humanitarian contexts?
Yeah, sure. Look, I fully acknowledge, Owen, that many of our colleagues in the WEM community and those out doing humanitarian work would have experienced far more security incidents than I have. But yeah, it doesn't take many to leave an impression, right? And there's different types of insecurity too. I've been in situations where I haven't felt in sort of in danger from a physical threat point of view in terms of violence, but I have felt reasonably insecure in terms of just my own health, like going to a disaster zone in Vanuatu after Cyclone Pam, when there's basically no power or running water in the majority of the country. You realize how reliant on you are on those kind of basic utilities to just keep yourself clean and safe and fed. And I'm pretty sure it was that trip where I took back a nasty dose of Shigella with me. I sort of, febrile, delirious by the time I was on my way home. So I don't know whether most people would consider that an insecure environment, but it definitely lacked some of the fundamentals that we depend on to keep us safe and healthy. Now, right down the other end of this sort of security spectrum, there's actual war zones, right? So in the project I was in South Sudan, this was a very active civil war zone, and we saw lots of patients coming in with particularly gunshot wounds. We were not allowed out of our compound, except for very rare occasions, like doing retrievals in the boat. And there was curfews and evidence of the violence around us. That was an obvious form of violence. Then there's that more implied kind, and I find this the most sinister kind. I don't know about you, Owen, but in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, with that incident you mentioned where my colleagues in our project were ambushed and kidnapped, we were evacuated. Now, we knew this was, part civil war, part cross-border war. I mean, the Congo wars are ongoing. Yeah, we were in this location where we knew we were surrounded by 100 different militia groups, with both the local population, the truly local population, and the several 100,000 internally displaced persons, all threatened on a daily basis with violence or experiencing violence. And that, in a way, was more scary for me than actually seeing these guys hobble in on their makeshift crutches with infected gunshot wounds, because there was evidence of it happening, but indirect evidence mostly, until we had this security scare and we were all evacuated. And that was probably the event that took the greatest toll on me psychologically, because you inevitably question what you would do if you were in that situation, right? What if had been me in the Land Cruiser? Like, how would have I reacted in that situation? Guys with AK-47 stopping you and ambushing you, and who knows what went down in that initial encounter. But these guys were hauled off into the mountains, and presumably ransom negotiations were undertaken, all the rest of it. You really question what would happen if that was you, and it's impossible to know until you're in that situation, right? I imagine a lot of our colleagues listening have had specific security training or come from military backgrounds, probably a lot more prepared for that kind of thing than I was. But until you're faced with it, it's something that certainly that I hadn't really thought about, but it carries with it a burden once you've experienced that feeling of true danger, true physical insecurity. It's a heavy thing.
Absolutely, and there's a real sense of, as you sense of overt and covert security, and the covert signs are the fruition of these people coming in with injuries and militia groups, but then the overt signs expressively, experiencing it yourself or to your colleagues. I can certainly bear testimony to that. Could you maybe speak to something else which came out within the book, and I can testify to as well, is this semblance of self-reflection and mental health. I really felt quite isolated on some of my trips within the humanitarian context, because you haven't got your community around you necessarily, you haven't got your friends or family around you. Could you maybe speak to your mental health and the experiences with, indeed, depression and drinking that you denote within the book, from your time on humanitarian missions?
Yeah, I want to once again acknowledge that I'm sure many people listening to us will have had their own experiences with this, but my own personal observations were that have been that most of us get into this work because we enjoy it on some level, right? Yes, we're in it for the altruistic, doing good, helping others side of it, but there's a selfishness that comes with that, I believe, and it's just up to us the extent to which we acknowledge that and admit it and sort of discuss it and negotiate it with our family or colleagues or bosses or whoever. So I got into this field of work because I found it interesting and, quite frankly, exhilarating at times. And that adrenaline kick, though, can be addictive in its own right. And again, it just depends where you are on the spectrum with this. I know plenty of people, I'm sure you do too, that really wouldn't survive outside that world. They are so addicted to the adrenaline, to the disaster, to the chaos that the sort of the ordinary world doesn't seem real or tolerable to them. I'm not necessarily one of those people, but I can see how that would happen. And most of us that do this kind of work have, sense of adventure, appetite for risk, and so we don't mind a bit of action on the sidelines, right? The blood on the boots, the rat tat tat echoing across the mountains, where sort of makes us feel alive, gives us a sense of purpose. But what it means is that there's payoffs, there's compromises and sacrifices. So we're away from home. Our loved ones are not only missing us but worried about us often. We are hanging out with other pretty hardcore, radical adrenaline junkies, and they're not necessarily always good influences on us from a mental health perspective. And everyone who's in that world is coping in their own way. Some of them, meditation and journaling. Some of them through some pretty hardcore drinking. I mean, one of the most famous books in our community is Emergency Sex and Other Desperate Measures, right? So there's plenty of ways to let off steam in this community, and I think it's fair to say that alcohol use or abuse is one of the most common. There are more sinister ones as well. The sort of substance abuse, sexual abuse, depression. Those all come with it to some extent. You were asking about my own experience with mental health or mental ill health. I'd say that has come not so much from the work itself, but from the circumstances that I found or put myself in. I'd always considered myself someone who was pretty relaxed and pretty chipper most of the time, and I also felt that I was someone who had pretty high level of capacity to manage things and just keep piling things on my plate, which all went swimmingly until it came crashing down around my ears. And a combination of, some professional pressures, work stress, but also money problems. Humanitarian work doesn't pay very well, doesn't pay the bills very well. Social isolation is a big one. And then the relationship issues that often accompany these kind of problems and this kind of work. That just for me was like this maelstrom of sort of stress that caused me to cave into myself like a neutron star. It was an absolutely horrible experience. And my heart goes out to anyone who is struggling with depression or other forms of psychological distress. All I can say is speak up, speak out. There are people around who care about you, and there is help available. We shouldn't feel alone. Loneliness is a poison, as I say in the book. I don't know whether you remember that line, but I really do believe that phenomenon of social isolation, which can exist even if you're surrounded by people, if you feel lonely, that's a very dangerous thing.
I can absolutely agree with that and reflect on my own experience and having that sense of community. But as you said, actually, within context, it's just because it's community doesn't mean it's healthy community. So it's actually trying to shape that community in an active way. Just as a joiner to that, Lachlan, could I maybe get you to speak to the off ramps or mitigation strategies for your mental health that you used whilst you're away, just as sort of maybe more of a positive question on the back of that?
Yeah, well, once I eventually conceded that I wasn't bulletproof after all, after having naively assumed that I may have been, it's a humbling experience to hit rock bottom in whatever form and need to claw your way back out again. So, the lessons I've learned from that, scrambling back out of the, from the edge of the precipice, they're not particularly amazing revelations. Most people listening would know what the keys are, but getting enough rest is important. So, I found the really important things for me were sleeping as much as my body would let me, eating right, getting some exercise, avoiding the intoxicants, and getting the sort of expert support that I needed, particularly from my GP and psychologist. So that was when I was in crisis mode, right? I was really, had a full-blown breakdown and needed to, find and expend the energy and sweat and blood and take advantage of all the love and support that I had around me to get out. But having recovered from that episode and having had a few close calls since then, because I don't think you ever quite shake it. The black dog of depression, once it's looming over your shoulder, never entirely goes away. But the off ramps you mentioned supposedly goes back to those key points. So I'm a lot more conscious now of where my limits are and when I feel like I'm nudging up against them, and what the warning signs are. So particularly fatigue, overwork, feeling out of shape physically, because it's no big surprise that mind and body are connected. I'm more sensitive to when the tanks are running low in those departments. And I've learned from hard experience, and also my wife isn't shy about reminding me about what I need to do when those signs are starting to show. But yeah, I don't have any other really insightful tips or tricks to offer, except I don't want to have too much of a spoiler alert for the book, but in Life and Death Decisions, there is a little detour through the explosion in research into psychedelics as therapeutic tools for certain types of psychological and psychiatric disorders. So that's in there for anyone who's curious.
Lachlan, a real theme throughout the book is around climate change and affecting the climate change wherever you can, just from a personal ownership and indeed from a personal mitigation perspective. Could you maybe just speak to the theme, because it seems to ring true to your heart all the way to the end of the book, and actually accentuated at the end of the book?
Yeah, so it's no secret that I'm a pretty passionate advocate for action against climate change, Owen. I've devoted a large part, possibly the majority of the last decade or so of my work to that topic. It was characterized by the previous WHO Director General, Margaret Chan, as the greatest global health challenge of the 21st century. Now, she wasn't wrong. She's not stupid. That was the case until the last few years, and we've all been distracted with this pandemic. And fair enough, it's a genuine global health catastrophe that was always coming, right? Pandemic was always coming. It was like the viral zoonosis from a spillover event, like most of them have been in human history, like most of them will be for the foreseeable future. But let's not get lost in the forest of the pandemic just a moment. Climate change hasn't gone away during the pandemic, and in fact was likely one of the sort of factors contributing to, well, it is generally speaking one of the factors that contribute to these zoonotic spillover events. But climate change as a topic has sort of increased exponentially in terms of the evidence basis over the last few decades, and the best evidence we have at present, which are deliberate underestimates, is that at least 250,000 avoidable deaths are occurring every year due to climate change. It's a massive underestimate. WHO makes that very clear. And it's an underestimate because that only applies to 4 categories of climate-sensitive health risk. That's malaria, diarrheal disease, natural disasters, and malnutrition. There are many other categories of climate-sensitive diseases and health risks. The latest report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, which is the largest scientific collaboration in the world, they released their 6th assessment report in the last 12 months. And that, in summarizing the evidence, made clear that around 70% of the burden of ill health around the world is linked to the environment and climate and is susceptible to climate change. So we ignore climate change at our peril. And in many places I've worked, particularly in the Pacific Islands, it's not something they're ignoring at all. It's a daily existential issue. So the impacts are broad and far-reaching. They are not some sort of distant future abstract problem. They are present in the here and now, causing hundreds of thousands of avoidable deaths every year already. And the trajectory that we're on in terms of carbon emissions, increasing temperatures, and all the effects that come with that. So altered weather patterns, increasing frequency and severity of hydrometeorological disasters, not just the rising of the sea, but the warming and acidifying of the sea, intrusion of salt into freshwater aquifers and soil, fishery loss, decreased crop yields, water insecurity, food insecurity. All of this is contributing, along with the changing patterns of vectors that spread infectious diseases, along with the increasing impacts on non-communicable diseases, both bringing new ones and, more importantly, increasing the burden on people with existing NCDs, and the mental health problems and the contributions to air pollution. All of that is really this sort of almost overwhelming health crisis that we are all facing, whether we see it or not, whether we like it or not, that is largely being ignored. So it's being ignored in terms of what the health impacts are of climate change and how urgent it is that we slow, halt, and reverse climate change itself. So after having spent years working on this topic for the World Health Organization in the Pacific, and having written my PhD on that topic and published a bunch of scientific papers, not only was I frustrated at the lack of action on adaptation to try and reduce the impact of these health problems, I was startled and alarmed and disturbed at the lack of general awareness of the fact that climate change was bringing health problems, and they were really bad and happening now and getting worse. So one of my main motivations for writing this book was to shine a light on these problems. I know that's pretty cliche, but I think, as I hope you would have experienced in reading the book, having glimpses into the lived experience of people in remote islands in the Pacific, the health problems they face, the contemporary reality of climate change and what that means for their future. Loss of land, loss of livelihoods, population displacement, loss of sovereignty, identity. Apply that on a global scale and consider what it means for climate-enforced migration, food and water insecurity, conflict, resource competition. It's ugly, man. It's ugly stuff. And while I don't want to just be a doomsayer, I wrote the book in what I hope and like to believe is a entertaining way. It is absolutely my intention that these heavy messages about serious health problems, including about climate change, are delivered via the book.
Just whilst we're on the topic of climate change, you do mention personal ownership within climate change, and you mentioned carbon offset, and you make concerted efforts to not take flights where possible, take the train or take other modes of transport. Whilst we're on the topic, as an adjoining question, from personal experience, I find it difficult to see Indigenous ownership of climate change when people were surviving day to day or week to week and just trying to provide food for their communities within Somalia or indeed within certain parts of sub-Saharan Africa. Could you maybe speak to how you saw the confluence of ownership at a local level within Indigenous groups, just to sort of take personal ownership in their ways?
Yeah. Look, the best examples I have are from the Pacific Islands, because that's where I lived and worked for several years. And I'm an adopted member of the Bene tribe in East Coast, Espiritu Santo in Vanuatu. And I spent a lot of time in the jungle there and know the community quite well. There are plenty of examples of contemporary adaptations, I would say, that where Indigenous people are very aware of how the climate is changing. I mean, no one is more aware. I mean, some farming communities, sure, but Indigenous people are far more connected to their environment, generally speaking, than non-Indigenous people, and they have been able to observe very clearly what changes have been taking place over the last few decades. And the most extreme examples of those changes are in atoll communities like in Kiribati, Tuvalu, where the majority of the population live on these tiny little crescents of coral in the middle of the ocean, the maximum elevation of which is just 2 or 3 meters above sea level. The majority of the population live within a meter, above sea level, and the sea is rising, and the salt's going into the aquifers and the soil, and the king tides are smashing them, and I've personally spoken to plenty of families and individuals who've needed to relocate twice in the space of 3 generations because of the rising seas. That's a big problem. It's also a big problem if you don't have food, and if your traditional crops can't grow in these salty, acidic soils. So there is a really interesting program of research being undertaken in the Pacific Atoll countries, which combines traditional knowledge around agriculture and I guess botany, and more modern or Western scientific approaches to agriculture to cultivate drought and salt resistant taro and cassava. So these are staples for these communities, but their food security is decreasing, and what that means is these communities are becoming more and more dependent on what? Crappy foods imported from overseas. So energy dense, nutrient poor imported garbage that's often dumped on these countries by other wealthier countries. What does that mean? The communities in these countries are experiencing absolutely skyrocketing rates of obesity, cardiovascular disease, kidney disease, cancers. The Pacific Islands, as a group, have the highest rates of non-communicable diseases in the world. And when you look at what is happening with climate change and these effects on food security, you can see how these factors are all linked and represent a true emergency. It's because of the Pacific that WHO declared a global emergency for non-communicable diseases a few years ago. The Pacific declared it 7 or 8 years before then. So there are examples of traditional knowledge and Indigenous ownership contributing to understanding and solutions when it comes to climate change, including health impacts. But there's an absolute enormous mountain of work yet to be done.
So on a bit of a lighter note, just within the book, there's some fascinating insights, Lachlan. You really do combine some quite deep and heavy knowledge from a climate change perspective and research, but you also smatter it with these anecdotal stories of innovation and resilience within low resource settings. So delivering babies with wearing a head torch and other innovations because the need is there. Could you maybe speak to how flexible and innovative you have to be in some of these resource environments or low resource environments?
Yeah, happy to. And I'm 100% certain that I'm not the only person that has delivered a baby by a light of a head torch. It's pretty common practice for many of us, I would imagine. But I had not realised before I embarked on this journey of rural and remote medicine and international humanitarian medicine, just how essential a head torch would be. I've spent nights on call, even in communities in Australia and like the Torres Strait, and then certainly in the Pacific and sub-Saharan Africa and elsewhere, where it's in my kit, it's in my bag next to my stethoscope, because you never know when you're going to need it, and it's not just stomping around at night, picking your way to the emergency tent and trying to not step in a puddle that's going to go up to your knees, or not step on a venomous snake, or not step on a landmine. These little things, or having a power failure, or needing to examine a patient in a dark little mud hut somewhere. It's all essential. So, delivered babies by a head torch. We've taken out an appendix by a head torch. I've treated snake bite by a head torch. Very, very useful bit of kit. But that more generally, that ability, or more accurately, the need to be flexible and think on your feet and make do with the resource that you have available is absolutely essential. And it's not something that's unique to me or special about me. In Papua New Guinea, the first time I went, I remember seeing this guy had fallen out of a coconut tree and had he had these kind of bilateral tib-fib fractures, and they weren't able to operate. So there was no open reduction internal fixations. There was no X fixes. It's just traction. So he was lying, semi-recumbent on the bed with these, 5-liter bottles of water attached via ropes to his ankles, and that was him for a couple of months. In the post cyclone disaster response in Cyclone Pam, we had such high rates of acute sort of asthma or obstructive airways disease that we not only ran out of oxygen, but we ran out of puffers and spacers for salbutamol. So we needed to chop up plastic bottles so that patients could use what puffers they had or we could find to deliver the bronchodilators effectively. And there's plenty of examples of people making do. I mean, there's I've got textbooks on improvised medicine. These are just really kind of superficial entry level amateur examples. I'm sure many of our listeners have got some more gnarly examples than the ones I've just shared.
Lachlan, throughout the book, there's a real semblance of flexibility just within your own practice. You say you're put in charge of $20 million wash, water, sanitation and hygiene initiatives or projects. Could you maybe just speak to, as we're starting to come into land in the conversation, could you speak to just how flexible you have to be in your approach to different subject domains, different speciality domains?
Yeah, well, I would have never imagined, training as a rural journalist in Australia. And, I'm first and foremost just a humble rural doctor, right? Just fighting the good fight, one patient at a time. But, to be frank, I did also then go on to do a second round of specialty training as a public health physician. And that definitely helped me, when I was sort of catapulted into these increasingly senior roles at the World Health Organization. Understand what I was supposed to do. Basically, I was the acting head of emergency humanitarian action and environmental health for WHO in the South Pacific for 12 months or so, and having a bit of experience with the organisation helped. Having just a decent sense of how to be organised and prioritise and think on the fly helped, and also training helped. But again, go back to your fundamental point. I think being willing to roll up your sleeves and give anything a go and learn on the job is a core attribute that many of us have, and has certainly served me well and is appreciated, right? Whether it's patients, communities, or colleagues and sort of senior folks in organizations, they appreciate that flexibility and adaptability. Two quick examples. When I was given this very unexpected promotion to be this acting head of emergency humanitarian action, environmental health, WHO, that was the director who had sort of seen my boss depart, and I don't know whether he'd really thought through what the succession plan was supposed to be, but he just basically called me into his office and chatted about how I'd been doing, and patted me on the shoulder and told me learning by doing about 5 times, and off I went. But he'd obviously been observing how I'd been progressing and had enough faith in me that he thought I could step up into the role. And then in a weirdly similar way, when I was making the switch from WHO to Médecins Sans Frontières, MSF here in Geneva, I didn't think I'd have a hope in hell because I hadn't kind of come up through the ranks, done my time in the field with MSF. But the medical director who gave me my first job, here at the international office in Geneva, it respected the time that I had spent kind of in the field, in inverted commas, in the Pacific with WHO and with Rocketship, the international health NGO that I started with a few friends. But he also could see the value in what I had been working on in terms of environmental health and climate change and medical education and whatnot, and was willing to give me a chance to apply that to this whole other thorny mongrel problem of antimicrobial resistance. He could see the parallels. These are complex, wicked problems. They sort of have intersectoral implications. They require interdisciplinary collaboration to solve. And so the point I'm trying to get at is if you're willing to be a non-specialist and if you are interested in a broad range of things and you are willing to just give it a crack, people will respect that, and you'd be surprised what counts as valuable experience later in your career, even if it's in a sort of strictly unrelated field.
So, Lachlan, could you maybe speak to Rocket Ship as an entity, and indeed as a non-for-profit, and just maybe unpack it for listeners, what you're trying to achieve, and indeed its inception?
Yeah, thanks, Owen. Appreciate you picking it up. So, Rocket Ship is a small international health non-profit organisation. It's an acronym, by the way. It stands for Remote Opportunities for Clinical Knowledge, Education, Training and Support for Health in the Pacific. It was born out of the realization that Pacific Island countries have far too health professionals, no surprise there, but they have really far too few doctors, and the doctors that they have are far too concentrated in the urban centres, particularly the capital cities. Again, this is not a phenomenon that's unique to the Pacific, but it was pretty stark when I was roaming around the region for a few years, and having come from, or having been a product of the Australian system of training rural generalists. There was the Australian College of Rural and Remote Medicine, specialty college with which I did my first round of training, was designed specifically to correct this imbalance, this maldistribution of doctors, and to equip doctors, rural generalists, with the skills they need to provide care for communities alone and unsupported. So in chatting with my colleagues and sort of senior health leaders around the Pacific, we realised that example from Australia, which has parallels in other countries too, right? Like New Zealand has the Division of Rural Hospital Medicine, and, Canada has the Society of Rural Physicians. There are examples of great training programs that train doctors to do specifically that. And we realised that there was an opportunity to adapt that model to the Pacific. We, in getting going, found ourselves sort of sucked a little bit into more just pure medical volunteerism. So sending doctors and nurses to areas of extreme workforce shortage, again, inverted commas, which is basically everywhere. I mean, Vanuatu, my sort of second home and beloved adopted country, usually only has doctors in 2 or 3 of its 9 provinces, right? So there's typically 4 or 5 or 6 hospitals that have no doctors at all. And so we'd be sending doctors there to basically just be cannon fodder, and same for nurses. And going back to our earlier discussion about security, we had a couple of close calls, and we realized that we had overreached, we were overstretched, and we needed to regroup and rethink and reposition ourselves. And that's when we realized that our real sort of role and niche and added value was in supporting the training of Pacific Island health professionals to become, for the doctors, rural generalists. And so I'm very proud to say that in the last few years, we've partnered with ministries of health or equivalent in, I think it's 5 different Pacific Island countries now. It's Timor-Leste, Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, Tonga, and Fiji, to set up postgraduate training programs in family, community, rural hospital medicine. And in some of those countries, like the Kingdom of Tonga, for example, we're on to our 4th cohort that are working towards their diploma and then onto their masters, which is a specialty equivalent qualification. And that to me it's definitely been one of the most rewarding aspects of my career. And if any of our listeners want to know more about Rocket Ship, you can check it out online. That's rocket-ship.org. Get involved. Feel free to donate. Feel free to get in touch if you want to go and spend some time in the Pacific. It's an amazing part of the world, the blue continent, the jewel in the crown of the planet Earth, I reckon.
So we'll put some links in the show notes to Rocket Ship as the non-for-profit. We'll also put links to Life and Death Decisions, so the book, and we'll make sure that is denoted within the show notes. So just to come into land on the conversation, Lachlan, and it's really apparent that you've marinated through various ecosystems over 30 countries in various continents, been dropped into some really difficult humanitarian contexts and some less so. But could you maybe just speak to a few salient learning points about your experiences of transitioning into cultures and how you can optimize that transition? Because it's doing it in so many various contexts, I'd be keen to understand maybe some of your learnings from transitioning into these cultures.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Interesting point to finish on, Owen. Humanity is a shared experience, right? Those of us who are open of mind and heart and up for adventure and interested in people and how the world works, there's an infinite amount out there to discover. And if you approach those experiences, based on my own humble experience, with an open mind, an open heart, and a sort of generous spirit, people will see that. Yeah, there's some horrible people out there, but people are mostly mostly nice. And there is a shared experience of humanity, no matter how different or exotic or other some people may appear. So yeah, I think recognizing that the fundamental humanity that we all share is really key. And I think, by the way, as health professionals, we have a very special, unique access to that. We have interactions with people at their most vulnerable, at their most intimate. I've personally treated women and children from completely different countries when I would not usually be able to have any contact with them at all. If I was just a non-medical white dude, I've treated army and militia people that, again, I would not normally have any contact with at all. But I've also had contact with people in the most extremely remote and difficult to reach locations. And again, I wouldn't have been there if I wasn't a doctor. So yeah, we have a shared experience of humanity, and being a health professional gives you unique access to the most intimate parts of the human experience, I think. There's a couple of practical tips. Whatever you can do, linguistically speaking, is going to be appreciated. So, I grew up as a English speaking Aussie, English only speaking Aussie. And so my sort of language learning has been as an adult, which is a lot bloody harder than as a kid, right? As I'm sure you'll all agree. But people appreciate the effort, even if it's just a few words. It's not hard. You don't need to be, a sort of linguistic genius. Just make an effort. And humor definitely helps. So again, okay, there's different senses of humor, and some people are more open to it than others. But generally speaking, I think if you smile and able to sort of interact with people in a way that makes them feel at ease, makes them laugh, that'll serve you well. Oh, and one more thing, learn people's names. Again, it's not hard. It's like I'm not a brilliant doctor, but I remember people's names, nurses and patients, and they think it's amazing. I'm like, oh, that's thank my mum. I'll leave it there.
Lachlan, listen, that's fantastic. I fundamentally believe in those points. Actually, I think people really notice when you make effort within their Indigenous language, and indeed when you're kind back to them, or indeed kind as a first mover in any of the key interactions. But absolutely, and everything you said absolutely resonates. Lachlan, I'd like to thank you for the last hour, and for your reflections. The book is both entertaining, somber, visceral, candid, and informative in equal measure. So I do highly recommend it as a read to anyone who's considering a life indeed in the adventure or a humanitarian context, because it's truly informative. So thank you for both writing it. We'll advertise it within the show notes, and indeed for your time today.
It's been brilliant. Thanks so much for having me, Owen. I had a great time. Appreciate it.
If you've enjoyed this episode of the World Extreme Medicine podcast, please subscribe, like, and share. And if you want to meet lots of other risk-taking, rule-bending, and inspirational people, then you need to be in Edinburgh on the 19th to the 21st of November for this year's conference. Tickets are on sale now. Go to extrememedicineexpo.com to find out more.